They found the door by accident, buried beneath a warped wooden hatch at the edge of a collapsing cellar. It was sealed with iron bolts so old they crumbled when touched. Beneath it, the air was cold, stale, and wrong. What lay below would not make headlines for years. If this kind of buried history matters to you, consider subscribing now and share where you're listening from in the comments as the story unfolds. The land sat deep in rural Arkansas, miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by trees that grew thick and close, shutting out light and sound. For generations, neighbors described the property as quiet, orderly, respectable, a place where nothing ever seemed to happen. The family who owned it were known by name across the county: church-going, hard-working, patriarchs of land and livestock. Their surname appeared on donation plaques, school ledgers, and handwritten church rolls. They were the kind of people no one questioned. Children were rarely seen. When they were, they moved stiffly. Their eyes stayed low. They spoke softly, if at all. Neighbors assumed strict discipline, old-fashioned values, the kind of parenting people no longer understood. No one imagined what lay beneath the soil. The house itself was unremarkable: white siding, a wide porch, a cellar built back when storms were feared more than laws. Over time, that cellar was expanded, reinforced, hidden. Family records show renovations passed down like inheritance. Each generation added locks. Each generation learned the rules. According to later testimony, the underground rooms were not built all at once. They evolved. Narrow stairs became ladders. Ladders became doors. Doors became walls. Walls became silence. Children who disobeyed were taken below. Children who asked questions were taken below. Children who cried too loudly were taken below. At first, it was called correction. Letters found decades later describe it as necessary isolation, spiritual cleansing, breaking the will before the soul is lost. The family's faith was rigid, absolute, and inward-facing. Outsiders were dangerous. Government was sinful. Schools were corrupting. Children were born stained and needed to be reshaped. The underground was where reshaping happened. Accounts from surviving descendants describe darkness so complete it erased time. Days measured by footsteps above. Meals slid through narrow slots. Punishments delivered without words. Some children stayed below for hours. Some stayed for weeks. Some grew up there. Birth records show missing children. Census data lists numbers that never align. Names appear once, then vanish. No death certificates, no graves. The family explained absences as illness, relocation, God's will. Local authorities accepted these answers without challenge. Church leaders never asked to see the children. Teachers were told the family would homeschool. Doctors were not called. When one neighbor reported hearing crying from the ground late at night, the sheriff dismissed it as livestock. The family patriarch at the time was a man widely respected for his discipline and generosity. He settled disputes, lent money, donated land. He also kept journals. Those journals would later be recovered from a sealed trunk, their pages brittle and careful. They spoke of purification, of generational weakness, of a belief that pain, when applied early and thoroughly, could eliminate sin from a bloodline. He wrote of children as vessels to be corrected, not protected. He documented the underground rooms in measured detail, dimensions, ventilation holes, lock mechanisms. He referred to them as chambers, never cells. When he died, his eldest son inherited everything, including the chambers. Testimony suggests the next generation refined the system. Rules became stricter. Silence became mandatory. Punishments lengthened. Children born into the family were taught early never to speak of what lay beneath the floorboards. They were told outsiders would take them away, that questions would damn them, that survival depended on obedience. Some learned to endure, some broke. One woman, now elderly, would later describe losing track of how old she was underground. She learned to count time by her own growth, by pain in her joints, by the sound of new babies crying above. She said there were others with her. Some never came back upstairs. The underground rooms were expanded again in this era. Dirt floors replaced with concrete, drainage added, chains installed, then removed when they proved too loud. Neighbors noticed fewer children overall. The family explained it as God's pruning. No one pressed further. When modern laws began reaching even the most isolated communities, the family adapted. Children were no longer locked away permanently. Instead, they were rotated. A system that left fewer marks, a system that left fewer witnesses. Still, cracks began to form. One child escaped. She ran barefoot through woods, dehydrated, terrified, repeating phrases she had been taught to fear saying out loud. When found, she told authorities she had lived underground. The report was filed. The family denied everything. The child was returned. Years passed before the next intervention. By then, the underground door had been disguised as foundation support, the chambers cleaned, evidence buried deeper. It took a land dispute to expose the truth. When surveyors marked property boundaries, they noted unusual subsurface structures. Old blueprints surfaced, renovation permits that never made sense. A warrant followed, and then the door. Investigators descended into rooms that smelled of mold, iron, and human waste. They found restraints bolted into concrete, scratches in the walls at height level, handwritten scripture carved into stone. They found toys. They found clothing layered in corners, each pile a different size. They found no bodies. That absence haunts the case to this day. The family denied everything, claimed the structures were storm shelters, root cellars, relics of paranoia. Some were charged, some were not. Many records disappeared. Survivors struggled to speak. Language itself felt unsafe. Many could not live above ground without panic. Some could not sleep in rooms without locks. Generations of trauma traced back to rooms without light. The property was eventually abandoned, the house collapsed, the land reclaimed by trees. But the chambers remain sealed. Historians debate how such a system survived so long. The answer is always the same: respectability, silence, fear dressed as faith. The story leaves one question unanswered. How many families like this were never found? And how many children are still waiting in the dark, unheard, because no one wants to believe what might be buried beneath an ordinary home?
The investigation did not end when the door was sealed again. It only retreated into paperwork, interviews, and the long silence that follows when a community realizes it has been complicit. In the weeks after the discovery, officials struggled to reconstruct what had happened beneath that house because the truth had been spread deliberately across generations. No single act, no single perpetrator, only a system, inherited and refined, designed to leave as little trace as possible. The surviving children were scattered, some placed with relatives who had known and said nothing, others sent to institutions unequipped to understand what underground living does to a developing mind. Psychologists noted symptoms that did not fit common categories: extreme aversion to light, panic triggered by open spaces, an instinct to whisper even when alone. Many refused to sleep in beds. They preferred the floor. Interviews revealed patterns that could not be ignored. Each generation of the family repeated the same language, the same justifications, the same words passed down like scripture: correction, cleansing, protection from the world above. Investigators uncovered letters exchanged between family elders and sympathetic religious leaders outside the county. None explicitly mentioned imprisonment. Instead, they spoke in code, extended fasting, solitary prayer, breaking stubbornness before it blooms. Those letters had been filed, archived, and forgotten. When journalists attempted to trace earlier complaints, they found reports dismissed as misunderstandings, anonymous tips marked unreliable. One deputy had written a note years earlier questioning the number of children living on the property. He was transferred shortly after. Former neighbors began to speak only once the family name lost its power. Even then, most chose anonymity. They described hearing muffled noises at night, seeing children vanish for months, then return thinner, quieter, altered. They told themselves it was none of their business. One former church member recalled sermons preached inside the family home, closed to outsiders. Sermons about obedience, about how children were born dangerous, about how mercy without discipline invited corruption. Children were present at those gatherings. They did not sit with the adults. They stood near the floorboards. The deeper investigators went, the clearer it became that the underground chambers were not simply a punishment space. They were an ideology made physical, a belief that fear could be engineered, that identity could be erased and rebuilt under pressure. Survivors described learning to dissociate before learning to read. Some could still map the chambers from memory, each turn, each wall, each place where sound traveled differently. One man, now middle-aged, said he could tell which sibling was crying by how the echo shifted. He had not seen some of them since childhood. There were no records of where they went. The family cemetery on the property raised further questions. Headstones bore dates that did not match known births. Some names appeared nowhere else. Ground-penetrating surveys suggested disturbed soil beyond marked graves. Permission to exhume was denied. Legal barriers multiplied. The case stalled not because evidence was lacking, but because it was fragmented across time. Statutes expired, witnesses died, memories blurred under trauma. What could be proven was limited. What was suspected was enormous. Mental health professionals later described the case as an example of multi-generational captivity, a phenomenon rarely documented outside war zones or cult compounds. Here, it existed quietly, protected by family, faith, and rural isolation. Children born into that house did not know they were imprisoned. They believed it was normal. That realization haunted those who survived the longest. They spoke of guilt for not escaping sooner, for not helping younger siblings, for enforcing rules when ordered to by parents who were also victims once. Abuse became tradition. By the time the land was condemned, most of the responsible adults were dead or infirm. Accountability dissolved into history. No dramatic trials, no full confessions. Only fragments. The chambers were sealed permanently by court order, deemed unsafe to enter. Officials cited structural collapse. Privately, some admitted another reason. There was nothing left they wanted to find. Yet the impact spread outward. Families who had intermarried with the bloodline began noticing patterns in their own homes. Extreme control, emotional numbness, fear of authority paired with blind obedience. Therapists traced behaviors back like roots. 3 generations underground had reshaped more than one family. The house is gone now, the land overgrown, but locals still avoid the area. Hunters refuse to camp nearby. Some claim the ground feels wrong, though they cannot say why. There are no signs, no memorials, only a stretch of Arkansas soil that absorbed decades of silence. And the unsettling truth that what happened there did not require monsters or madness or anything supernatural at all. Only ordinary people, convinced they were right, and a world willing to look away.
The story did not fade after the land was abandoned. It moved into court files, medical archives, and the quiet lives of people who carried the underground with them wherever they went. Years after the chambers were sealed, a state research team was granted limited access to case materials under the guise of a longitudinal trauma study. What they found challenged many assumptions about recovery, memory, and accountability. Survivors did not recall events in a straight line. Their memories came in fragments, smells, pressure, the sound of locks turning. Some could not remember daylight from childhood at all. One man described learning that the sky changed color only after he left the property. As a child, he believed it was always gray. When shown photographs of sunsets later in life, he assumed they had been altered. Medical evaluations revealed physical markers consistent with long-term confinement, vitamin deficiencies associated with lack of sunlight, bone density irregularities, chronic respiratory issues linked to damp enclosed environments. These findings were documented. They were also quietly archived. Attempts to reopen criminal proceedings met resistance. Attorneys argued that the acts occurred under historical standards of discipline. Others claimed religious protection. Several witnesses recanted after pressure from extended family networks still loyal to the old beliefs. Silence proved more durable than truth. One former child, now a parent, attempted to file a civil case on behalf of siblings who never reappeared. The court required proof of death. There was none. No bodies, no records, no official acknowledgement that they had ever existed. The underground had erased them twice. As attention waned, the family name began to reappear in public life, not on that land, but elsewhere. New towns, new churches, new businesses. The same language, softened, repackaged. Strict values, strong discipline, private family matters. Those who recognized the patterns felt powerless to intervene without evidence. They had learned, painfully, how easily concerns could be dismissed. In therapy sessions, survivors described dreams of still being underground while living ordinary lives above. Jobs, marriages, children. The fear was not of confinement returning, but of realizing it had never fully ended. Control lingered in their thoughts, obedience in their reflexes. Some repeated behaviors they hated. Others rejected structure entirely, unable to tolerate rules of any kind. Both extremes traced back to rooms without windows. Historians reviewing the case later framed it not as an isolated atrocity, but as an example of how abuse can become invisible when wrapped in tradition. When passed parent to child without interruption, cruelty loses its shock. It becomes routine. The most disturbing discovery came quietly. A box of audio recordings found among unrelated archival material, mislabeled decades earlier. Tapes of interviews conducted by a social worker who never filed a final report. On the recordings, children spoke calmly about being taken underground, about rules, about silence, about siblings who finished their time and never came back. The interviewer's voice trembled. The report was never submitted. The social worker left the profession soon after. No explanation was recorded. Today, access to those tapes is restricted, their existence acknowledged only in footnotes. Requests to release them publicly have been denied, citing privacy concerns. Privacy, once again, outweighing exposure. The land in Arkansas remains unmarked. New growth has softened the ground. Animals burrow where children once sat in darkness. Rain fills spaces that were meant to confine. Nothing visible remains. Yet the case continues to surface in academic discussions, whispered about among investigators, therapists, and historians who study multi-generational abuse, not because it was unique, but because it lasted so long. 3 generations raised to believe the underground was love. 3 generations taught that suffering was salvation. The unanswered question is no longer how it happened. It is how many times it has happened elsewhere, quietly, legally, patiently. And how many doors like that one remain closed, waiting for someone to stumble upon them by accident. Time did what courts would not. As years passed, those directly responsible slipped further into infirmity or death, carrying their justifications with them. What remained were second-hand memories, incomplete records, and a trail of people shaped by something they were never allowed to name. Yet the underground did not stay buried in silence forever. In a neighboring county, an unrelated child welfare case triggered a familiar unease. The language in interviews echoed phrases pulled from the Arkansas files. Isolation as discipline, darkness as correction, obedience framed as love. An investigator trained years earlier on historical abuse patterns requested archived material for comparison. The resemblance was undeniable. It suggested transmission, not of blood alone, but of ideology. The belief system that justified the chambers had not died with the house. It had migrated, diluted just enough to survive scrutiny, strong enough to inflict damage without leaving obvious marks. Isolation rooms replaced cells, religious counseling replaced confinement, punishment became psychological instead of physical, more difficult to prove, more difficult to stop. Survivors from the original property were contacted quietly, asked to review transcripts from the new case. Several refused. Others listened in silence, faces tightening as words they had not heard in decades resurfaced unchanged. Correction, breaking the will, protection from corruption. One woman ended the session early. She said she could smell the underground again. Mental health experts later concluded that the Arkansas family had created a closed moral universe, one that reproduced itself through fear and reward. Children raised in it learned not only to endure suffering, but to administer it. Authority was never questioned, only transferred. That realization reframed the case. It was no longer just about what happened beneath one house. It was about what happens when abuse is taught as virtue. In private correspondence between state agencies, concerns were raised about how many similar cases had been misclassified over the decades, how many reports dismissed as strict parenting, how many children lost not to violence, but to systems that quietly erased them. No task force was formed, no public reckoning followed. The cost, officials argued, would be too high, too many institutions implicated, too many failures exposed. And so the Arkansas chambers became a reference point rather than a warning, a footnote. Among survivors, aging brought a new fear, that their memories would die with them, that the underground would become rumor instead of record. Several began recording testimonies privately, storing them with attorneys, universities, anyone who would promise not to destroy them. Some asked only that they be released after death. They wanted the truth to outlive their fear. One man who had spent his earliest years underground described standing on the abandoned land decades later. He said the ground looked ordinary, softer than he remembered. He pressed his hand into the soil and felt nothing beneath. That frightened him more than the chambers ever had, because it meant the place could disappear completely. And when places disappear, stories follow. The final legacy of the Arkansas family is not the chambers themselves, but the gap they left behind. The missing children, the missing records, the missing courage to confront what had been allowed to continue for so long. History prefers clean endings. This story does not have one. Only the knowledge that ordinary homes can contain extraordinary cruelty, and that without vigilance, silence becomes inheritance. Somewhere beneath another house, beneath another family's certainty, a door may still exist, unmarked, unquestioned, waiting. Years later, when the last of the original survivors reached old age, a quiet urgency set in. Memory was fading. Details softened at the edges, faces blurred, but certain sensations remained intact, preserved with unsettling clarity. The weight of a door closing, the absence of sound, the feeling of being deliberately forgotten. Those sensations became the final evidence. A small, unofficial archive began to form, assembled not by the state, but by survivors, and a handful of scholars who understood how easily records vanish. Audio testimonies, handwritten recollections, drawings made by adults whose hands shook as they recreated spaces they had not seen in decades. None of it was dramatic. That was the most disturbing part. The accounts were calm, precise, devoid of spectacle. Children locked underground were not described as horrors, but as routine, as consequences, as lessons. This consistency troubled researchers more than any single act of cruelty. It suggested normalization so complete that outrage never had a chance to form. One document, written by a survivor in late life, described the moment they realized something was wrong. It was not during confinement, not during punishment. It was years later, watching their own child sleep peacefully in an unlocked room. The realization felt dangerous. They checked the locks repeatedly. The underground had trained them to fear freedom. As the archive grew, comparisons were drawn to other closed family systems across American history. Frontier isolation, religious extremism, patriarchal authority reinforced by land ownership and silence. The Arkansas case fit too well into a pattern that had long existed but was rarely acknowledged. Abuse that survived by appearing ordinary. The missing children remained the central wound, names spoken only by siblings who remembered them faintly, ages guessed, fates unknown. Some researchers suspected unmarked graves beyond the property. Others believed children were transferred, traded, or abandoned under the guise of religious placement. None of these theories could be proven. The underground had done its work thoroughly. In the absence of answers, speculation became its own danger. Survivors worried that exaggeration would discredit what little truth remained. They insisted on restraint, on facts, on allowing the horror to emerge without force. They had learned what happens when authority controls narrative. Near the end of the archive project, a simple question was posed to surviving participants. What do you want people to understand? The answers were strikingly similar. That monsters were not required. That love can be used as a weapon. That cruelty does not always look violent. One response was recorded last. A man who had lived underground longer than he had lived above it. His voice was steady. He said the worst part was not the darkness. It was knowing that everyone above knew where he was, and chose not to look. When the archive was finally sealed, its contents restricted but preserved, there was no public announcement, no press release, no ceremony, just another box placed into climate-controlled storage. Safe, quiet, easy to ignore. The land in Arkansas continues to exist without recognition. Children play elsewhere. Families gather for holidays. New houses are built over old foundations in other places, other towns. History moves forward. But beneath it all, the lesson remains unresolved. That when suffering is hidden long enough, it stops being shocking. It becomes tradition. And when tradition is protected, the underground is never truly gone.
In the final years of review, attention shifted away from the family and toward the systems that allowed them to endure. Not with accusations, with silence.
Files from child welfare agencies revealed patterns of hesitation, reports marked inconclusive, follow-ups postponed, jurisdictions passed between offices until responsibility dissolved. Each delay appeared minor on its own. Together, they formed a barrier as solid as any locked door. The Arkansas case was cited internally as an anomaly, a closed chapter, something unlikely to repeat. Yet policy analysts noted how often isolation, religious exemption, and rural autonomy intersected in similar reports nationwide. In those cases, intervention depended not on evidence, but on persistence, and persistence, over time, eroded. The underground thrived on that erosion. Survivors spoke of a strange reversal in adulthood. They found themselves defending the very rules that had imprisoned them. Structure felt safe. Control felt familiar. Chaos, not confinement, triggered panic. Freedom had no language. Therapists described this as adaptive loyalty, a survival response where victims align with authority to reduce harm. In the Arkansas family, that response was cultivated deliberately. Children were praised for enforcing discipline on younger siblings. Obedience was rewarded. Compassion was suspicious. This internalization complicated every later attempt at justice. Witnesses contradicted themselves, minimized harm, expressed gratitude toward their abusers. Courts struggled to interpret testimony shaped by fear rather than intent to deceive. The missing children were revisited one final time. Advanced forensic techniques scanned aerial photographs from decades past. Subtle depressions in soil, anomalies in vegetation growth, nothing definitive enough to justify excavation. Officially, the count remained unknown. Unofficially, most investigators believed the number was higher than anyone wanted to record. As public memory faded, the case became academic, a teaching example stripped of names, a cautionary tale discussed in seminars and journals. Distance made it safer, but distance also removed urgency. One historian noted how the most dangerous crimes are those that do not require secrecy, only indifference. The Arkansas family did not hide in darkness alone. They hid in plain sight. Children confined underground did not disappear because no one noticed. They disappeared because noticing required action. The last known descendant connected to the property changed their name and relocated. In a brief interview years later, they refused to discuss the past. Only one sentence was recorded. It was how we were taught to love. No further explanation was offered. That sentence became the quiet epitaph of the case, not carved in stone, not placed on land, but carried forward as warning, because the underground was never just a place. It was an idea that suffering can be justified, that control can be moral, that silence can be virtuous. As long as those ideas persist, the chambers do not need walls. They rebuild themselves wherever no one is willing to look down and ask what is being hidden beneath their feet. In the years that followed, the story settled into a strange afterlife. It was no longer actively investigated, yet it refused to disappear. It surfaced in quiet ways, in training manuals that avoided naming it, in whispered references between social workers who recognized familiar warning signs, in the uneasy pauses that followed when someone asked how something like that could happen for so long. No one had a satisfying answer. What remained were patterns. Researchers studying generational trauma began to trace how the underground shaped not just fear, but identity. Survivors often described themselves as unfinished, as if part of them had been formed in darkness and never fully adapted to light. Decision-making felt dangerous. Choice felt like disobedience. Some avoided having children entirely. Others became hyper-vigilant parents, haunted by the idea that harm could be invisible and still destroy a life. The Arkansas case quietly influenced changes in how long-term isolation was defined in child welfare assessments. New language emerged: environmental deprivation, coercive confinement, psychological imprisonment. Still, enforcement lagged behind terminology, because the problem was never a lack of words, it was a lack of will. In private correspondence uncovered later, one former official admitted that confronting the case fully would have meant confronting too many others, families with similar structures, institutions that looked the other way, communities that preferred certainty over truth. The underground, in that sense, was inconvenient. It asked questions no one wanted to answer. Among the survivors, aging brought clarity as well as grief. Some said they no longer felt anger. Others said anger had become useless without accountability. What remained was a quiet resolve to speak plainly, without embellishment. They had lived with exaggeration imposed on them long enough. One survivor described visiting schools to talk about child safety. They never mentioned the chambers. They spoke only about listening to children, about noticing absence, about asking questions even when answers felt uncomfortable. They said discomfort was temporary, silence was permanent. The missing children continued to cast the longest shadow. Their absence resisted closure. No names could be spoken publicly, no stories fully told. They existed only in memory, fragmented and fading. In that way, the underground succeeded beyond its physical limits. It erased people, not violently, methodically. The land itself changed hands again. Developers considered building. Plans were drawn, then quietly abandoned. Soil tests revealed instability, too many hollow spaces beneath the surface, too many unknowns. It was easier to leave it alone. Locals said the ground never quite settled. At night, animals avoided it. Whether that was true or not mattered less than what people believed. Belief had always shaped the story. In the end, the Arkansas family left no manifesto, no final confession, no dramatic unraveling, just a lineage of damage that spread outward, thinning with each generation but never fully disappearing. The underground did not end with a door closing. It ended with a realization that came too late, that cruelty does not require chaos, only certainty. Only obedience, only a world willing to accept that what happens behind closed doors is not its responsibility. And that is why this story does not rest easily in the past, because it asks a final, unsettling question. Not what happened beneath that house, but how many times it has happened since, quietly, legally, patiently, while everyone above ground carried on as if nothing was wrong. Eventually, even the echoes began to fade. Those who carried first-hand memories grew fewer each year. Voices that once spoke in careful fragments fell silent, leaving behind recordings, transcripts, and the uneasy sense that something essential had been lost before it was fully understood. What remained was interpretation. Scholars debated language, investigators debated thresholds, communities debated whether revisiting the past served any purpose at all. The underground became a case study rather than a place, its reality flattened into theory. That too was a kind of burial. The final documents related to the Arkansas family were sealed under routine archival procedure. No scandal, no objection. Just a stamped date and a locked shelf. Access restricted to those who already knew what to look for. Future generations would need permission to remember. In quiet moments, some survivors wondered if that was how it was meant to end. Not with justice, but with containment.
The same instinct that built the chambers now preserved the records, control reasserting itself under a different name. They found little comfort in that symmetry. One survivor, interviewed near the end of their life, offered a reflection that would become the last recorded testimony. They said the underground did not destroy them. It taught them something more frightening: how easily people adapt. Children adapted to darkness, adults adapted to silence, communities adapted to absence, and institutions adapted to not asking why. The chambers beneath that Arkansas house collapsed long ago, crushed by time and neglect, but the idea that sustained them proved more durable than concrete. It lived on in habits, in language, in the quiet acceptance of harm framed as tradition. That is the legacy. Not the rooms, not the locks, but the lesson that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives calmly, dressed as care, and stays because no one demands that it leave. The ground above the chambers is quiet now. Wind moves through trees that have grown where children once waited in the dark. Nothing marks the place, nothing warns the curious. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, that without memory, without vigilance, the underground does not need to be rebuilt. It is already there, waiting.